Hi folks, Rich here. Welcome to part 2 of my pedalboard demo. So what I'm going to do is show you what's on my board, talk a little bit about the pedals themselves. I'm going to give you a few tips which I've kind of gathered from my experience of years of building and making mistakes building my own pedalboards. And then I'm going to run you through some of my favourite sounds and talk about what I use them for. I've never put this on my lap before. Okay, so this is my pedal board. I'm going to quickly tell you what each pedal is and give you the signal chain at the same time. So we start off by going into the tuner, which is just a TC Polytune. From there we go into this true bypass looper from Loop Master down here. In loop 1 we have the Ego Comp, the mini Ego Comp from Wampler. In loop 2 we have the Tim pedal by Paul Cochran. In loop 3 we have the Morning Glory by JHS, which is kind of like a, I think it's based on the old Marshall Blues Breaker pedals, which I used to own one, but it kind of became unreliable, so which is why I picked up one of these. In loop 4 we have one of my favourite pedals of all time, the Animal OD by Rocket Pedals or J Rocket Audio Designs. And then in loop 5 we have the Blue Collar Drive by Menatone by Brian Mena, which is again one of my favourite boxes ever. Coming out of the switcher here we go into a volume pedal. So this is post all the drives. From there we go over to this, which is an old custom shop full tone Deja Vibe. From the Deja Vibe we go into the Strymon Dig, and then into the Strymon Flint. Underneath the board I've got a buffer by LA Sound Design, which buffers on the way in and on the way out as well. So the Flint goes into the buffer, which is then wired to these locking neutral jacks inside the board. So my first sort of tip, I suppose, is about layout. So just to explain why I've done this the way I have, I've used loopers in the past, and then on the last one I did, I was trying to sort of downsize, so I didn't use one. But what I found was that particularly when playing really dark stages like theatres, is that it's very easy to kick the knobs and move your settings on your pedals when you're fishing around for your foot switch with your foot. So I decided to put all the pedals that I need to access all the time in the looper, so all of the overdrives. It also means that they don't take quite such a physical hammering. Pedals like the Blue Collar are fairly old now, and I'd like to sort of prolong their life for as long as possible. The reason I don't have these 3 in the looper is, one, I hardly ever get to switch this on. I just like it and will sort of play with it for my own amusement, but don't use it an abundance on gigs. And these 2 are pretty much always on in some form or another, so for me it didn't make much sense having them in a loop, because I always have a subtle reverb running, and I always have one of 2 different delay sounds running. So my first pedalboard tip relates to layout, and it is, make sure that you physically test out your layout before you commit to it. You want to make sure that you can access the pedals that you use most frequently with complete ease, and that there's not a risk of you kicking or moving the controls on other pedals when you're trying to access them. It might be that you decide to have some of your taller pedals at the back so that there's a good amount of clearance when you're going for them. This is quite a tall pedal, and although I don't use it a bunch, it kind of clears this one by enough of a distance that I'm never going to accidentally move the controls on this by trying to access this one. So just do a dummy run, secure it with like a week of Velcro, and kind of almost run through a gig scenario physically, you know, going through your pedal changes as you would on a gig, and make sure that it's comfortable, because anything which is kind of a little bit awkward will really start to grate when you're kind of 50 gigs in with the board. So try and sort of test it out as thoroughly as possible before you start soldering. Tip number 2, I'd really recommend that no matter how big or small your pedalboard is, that you invest in a buffer. For me, this is just the simplest way for you to preserve the sound of your amp, and just kind of not have to worry about that kind of side of it, of kind of capacitance build-up if you're running through a lot of pedals, or varying degrees of quality of buffer in different pedals as well. I think definitely have a buffer either at the start or end of your chain, but kind of ideally both. It kind of seems excessive, especially for something where this is not like a humongous board. But I found that it's the best way to preserve all the character and the responsiveness of your amp, which for me is, and I'm sure it is for you guys as well, really important. My third tip is that I've found that having locking jacks on your board, and also consolidating the place on your board where your inputs and outputs are, has also been really useful, and I wouldn't really do it any other way now, just because maybe you've got a kind of particularly energetic front person who periodically comes and kicks your input out of your pedalboard. You can kind of avoid that with these. Okay, let's go through some sounds. So to give you a reference point, this is my clean tone. It's the Suhr Badger set, really clean. It's kind of like a pedal platform sort of thing in this instance. So I pretty much always have the Strymon delay on in some form or another. So most of the time it's set like this. It's mixed sort of fairly low so that it doesn't really get in the way of anything. The other sound I use a lot is this one, which if I just give you a, we can see we've got that kind of quarter note with the dotted eighth thing happening. So some of my favourite things to do with that, I'll put the compressor on and use it for kind of like Landau style, 80s Landau style swells. And kind of pretty clean stuff. If I turn the delay off, I love this compressor for sort of funky style stuff. So. You can go super compressed with it by upping the sustain. So it's usually set somewhere between sort of 12 and 3 o'clock on the sustain control on the compressor. Moving on, I have the Tim. This I tend to use as like a very edge of breakup sort of sound. I think of it as being a bit Vox AC30-ish. The tone controls on this pedal are actually cut controls. So what I tend to do is cut quite a lot of the bass from it. Okay, and if I give it a whack, it will just crunch a little bit. So each, the way that this board is kind of structured is that each pedal going from right to left has got a little bit more gain than the last one, and they all have kind of specific purposes, I guess. So moving on to the Morning Glory, this I kind of like for slightly Hendrixy style. If I go to sort of single coil mode for a second. And if you up the drive control to about 2 o'clock, then it's cool for like a single coil lead sound. Moving on, one of my favourite pedals ever. So this has got 2 modes on it that can be engaged via the snarl switch on the Animal OD. In the kind of normal position, it's more plexi-ish, so we get... which is kind of like the next logical stage on from where we got to with the Morning Glory. So they're kind of incrementally getting a little bit gainier, and each one's akin to a certain character. So we've got something which is a bit Foxish, something which is Marshallish, and then we've got the next pedal, which I'll show you in a second. Before I do that, let's flick on the snarl switch. Then we have the monotone blue collar, which is set very similar to the Animal, but just with like a bit more volume for sort of lead boost stuff. And that's pretty much it for the drives. Moving on, finally we've got the full tone Deja vibe, which I like for adding a bit of character to clean parts like this. Gives it a nice sort of chewy thing. A couple of like final little things I can show you. The Flint has got a really cool reverb on it, an 80s verb, and if you crank the decay up and the mix up a little bit as well, it's great for super ambient kind of stuff. So again, I'll show you with a bit of delay, a bit of compression. And obviously there's also a great tremolo circuit in this box as well, which I'll show you real quick. Which I really like. And that's kind of pretty much it, really. A couple of last sort of pointers I'll give you. From my point of view, the way I've kind of got this set up is that very few of these are set to unity gain. They're all kind of set to a level which is dependent on their context. So, for example, the Menotone is set significantly higher than most of the other stuff because that's going to be my lead boost. I know that I can kind of get away with that because I'm not going to be playing lots of sort of low frequencies, so it's not going to screw with the sound guide too much. I have the Animal again set like a little bit higher than I would the other pedals, because I'm kind of viewing that as my rock box, and I know that the drummer's going to be sort of hitting a little bit harder during those moments, so to keep up with the rest of the band it needs to be set a little bit higher, and so on and so forth. So they've all got a specific context in mind for like a live scenario, and that's how I've kind of set them up. It's also the reason why there tends to be not a lot of bass in my sound, because I've worked with enough bands and sort of bigger ensembles to know that's not what your sound engineer needs. He needs you to sit in that very specific kind of mid bracket, which is where the guitar sort of lives. And so lots of kind of subby or woofy bass stuff, although it might sound great in the room, in the context of a band it's not going to be useful, and so that's how I tend to sort of dial this board in. The very last thing I'll sort of say is that although I've got my amp set up super clean, mostly so you can hear exactly what each pedal is doing, what its specific character is for the different overdrives, I would say that generally speaking, getting your amp to a point where it's just about breaking it by itself is kind of the ideal point for it to be interacting with different overdrive pedals and stuff. You get this sort of marriage of the amp and the pedal at that point, whereas if you have a super ultra clean sound with loads and loads of headroom and then you're just sticking overdrive on top of it, sometimes it's maybe not as convincing as if you can get the amp working a little bit hard as well. But it really depends what you're going after. But I'll kind of set my divided by 13 to the point where I know that if I really dig in, it'll just about start to break up, and that's kind of where a lot of these boxes are happiest. Anyway, I hope this has been useful, maybe, to you guys. I've tried to include a few tips. I've actually got a mini series on pedalboard building from a board that I built a few years ago, further back in my channel, so feel free to go and check that out if you want to learn about the soldering side of things and the layout and sort of routing cables underneath the board. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you guys soon.